Hello and welcome to the webinar hosted by the Good Care Group on the very large subject of preventing elder financial abuse. And we are very privileged and honoured to have an expert in the field, Paul Smith, who has created this wonderful presentation for us today to give us a really great insight into elder financial abuse. First of all, I just want to cover off some housekeeping, just to make you aware that all the cameras for the attendees have been turned off for today, and we've also placed the microphones on mute, so that will avoid any unwanted distractions or background noises. We are also recording the session today, so the presentation will be available afterwards for you to listen to at your convenience, and there will be an opportunity to put forward any questions that you may have using the chat forum. Now you can find the chat forum to the right hand side of the screen. There is a toolbar, and within the toolbar you will find a chat forum. By all means, type away any questions that you may have, and myself and Paul will certainly endeavour to answer them. If you wish to take any questions offline, you're very welcome to email us. Our contact details are also available within this presentation. So just to introduce myself, my name is Gemma Locke. I'm Head of Business Development for the Good Care Group. I'm just going to provide an overview of the Good Care Group, and then moving on to care options and providing information about the differences between regulated versus unregulated, and giving a very high level overview about the CQC, the Care Quality Commission, and their inspection criteria. After which you can certainly put forward any questions you may have, and then we'll move across to the main event, which is the elder financial abuse section, which is delivered by Paul Smith, who is a specialist forensic accountant. And once again, then be an opportunity to put forward any questions you may have to Paul. So just to provide an overview about the Good Care Group, we have been providing high quality living care to our clients across the country for over 10 years. And the care we deliver is focused on keeping people safely and happily in the comfort and familiarity of their own homes, and also importantly looking at improving the overall health and well-being. Living care is provided in England and also Scotland on a one-to-one basis, and it is very much highly personalised to the individual client and their needs. We are the only living care provider that has been rated outstanding by CQC in all 5 measures, which I will touch on a little bit more in detail in a moment. And our expert living carers are highly trained to provide care and support that really positively enhances the quality of those living with specialist conditions such as dementia or Parkinson's, or those requiring additional support after having a stroke or have palliative end of life needs. So we make sure that they receive the best possible life they can possibly have in the comfort and surroundings of their own homes. We're also proud to say that we offer a nurse-led and an OT-led service for those clients who have more complex medical needs, and we can enable fast and effective discharge from hospital to home to ensure that they've got this comprehensive care plan in place and give them the advice and guidance they need, and also source the equipment that they need to ensure that they can live well at home. So we can offer ongoing services as well as shorter respite care services, and we do offer a service for companionship care for people who may have lost a loved one recently and just need that additional support, as well as those clients who have mobility and frailty concerns where they just feel a little bit more confident if someone was helping them around the home and supporting them with their daily activities. So looking at the available care options, traditionally we would look at the care home route, but I just want to really highlight the stat to you is 97% of people given the choice would prefer to receive care in their own homes. So this was a living care survey that was as a result of a survey in 2017, and I think we have the mindset historically of really thinking as we get to a certain stage in our lives and we have increased needs, the natural route would be to go into a residential care home, or if you have further needs and you require specialist care, you would go into a nursing home setting. And with that stat there, it's simply that people don't necessarily want to go down that route, but are not necessarily aware of the options. And clients who are coming out of hospital and need a little bit more support, quite often the pathway is saying that they should go into a care home environment for respite and reablement. But actually we can look at lots of offerings within the home environment So typically we imagine home care as carers going in to support clients on an hourly basis, maybe to get them out of bed and support them having their breakfast, getting them washed and dressed in the morning, and then maybe coming back over lunchtime and early evening to help support them and transition them into bed. But that simply is not necessarily all that there is to offer. Lots of hourly care providers do also offer companionship care. They also look after personal care as well as light duties around the home. And they can also, in addition, support those clients who are looking to come out of hospital to home. And this is really where living care comes into its own. So living care, as I've just highlighted, is those carers that come and live with the clients, and they provide that round-the-clock care of companionship and support to allow those clients to live a better quality of life whilst improving their health outcomes. So, as you know, home is where the heart is. It's where all your special memories are and your treasured possessions and your pet dog or cat that you dearly loved over the years. So it's really looking at how we can enhance the person's life to ensure that they have the best possible environment at home and enhance their well-being. So looking at regulated versus unregulated, the Good Care Group is classed as a regulated service. So we are fully managed and we fall under the framework of the Care Quality Commission. We've also been rated excellent for quality care and support by the Scottish Care Inspection as well. So we provide a fully managed service. So this means that if a carer is unavailable to care for you, whether that's a planned holiday or an unexpected period of leave, or it might be sickness, we can give a guarantee that we can cover and draw on our resources to make sure that the client is never left alone. So we have a standby professional carers known as our rapid response carers and our relief team of carers, and we can work quickly to ensure that, as I say, no one's left on their own. It doesn't matter what the circumstances present. And every client is supported by a regional manager and also a dedicated care manager. And they are all then supported by a central team of regional support assistants. So this is where the fully managed within the Good Care Group, but this is what we offer, is we have that overarching support, and we also have a 24/7 support line which both our clients and our carers can use in the case of an emergency. So it's looking at kind of that governance, making sure that we have everything covered. And unlike introductory agencies who simply introduce the carer to the clients, they then, the client or the client representative would be responsible for employing and contributing their salary, so paying their salary directly to the carer, whereas we fully employ our carers to make sure that we take on the responsibility to do all the due diligence checks. We are responsible for the training and the governance and the oversight to make sure that that care is delivered and the care plan is executed to the letter. So I would very much say, from an introductory agency point of view, if people are considering going down the introductory agency route where carers are self-employed, those clients or the client representative would be responsible for any costs associated with recruiting that carer, and also they will be responsible for arranging employer and public liability. And most importantly, it is down to them to do the due diligence to make sure that that carer is of good standing. So at the Good Care Group, we take on, as a regulated provider, all of the due diligence to make sure that they have the right skill sets, the right qualifications and experiences. They also are of good standing in character, so we do all the referencing checking, and we also check all their various background checks to ensure that they are who they say they are and their experience is justified. So we, as I say, check all their references. So with the introductory agency, it is down solely to the person who has the contract, i.e. the client or the client representative. And if in the event that the carer is unavailable, it is then also down to the client or the client representative to source a replacement carer. So just to provide an overview about the Care Quality Commission, they look at a framework inspection criteria known as CLOE. So CLOE stands for Key Lines of Inquiry, and it looks at, is the service safe? Is it effective, caring and responsive? And is it well led? So we are very proud to say, as we've highlighted, we are effectively 5-star outstanding in all of those criteria. So the Care Quality Commission would typically inspect a regulated care provider every 2 to 3 years. Although if there's areas of concern, they would do an inspection and put together a plan of action in agreement and alignment with the care provider, and then they would monitor to make sure that that plan of action was being executed and the requirements that were identified put in place to address those potential needs or issues. So the Care Quality Commission Inspection Ratings ranges from outstanding right the way down to inadequate. So there's good and requires improvement, then inadequate. So in order for a provider to be rated outstanding, they must achieve at least 2 outstanding criteria, so hitting the CLOEs. So 2 of the 5 criteria they must achieve in order to be awarded the outstanding. So that's just a whistle-stop tour. I would very much say to you, if you are interested in looking at CQC and a little bit more detail about CLOE and the framework of how the CQC inspect, please refer to their website. It's an absolute fantastic, useful resource for you. And you can also put in your postcode or an area, and then you can search for regulated care providers, and then you can look at their most recent inspection reports. And I would highly recommend that you do that if you are exploring care, because it gives you a really good visual and understanding about the quality of care from that local care provider. So on the screen is my contact details. Please feel free to email me or contact our client services team directly. You're very welcome to. If you have any questions, please feel free to complete the chat forum now and I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you. So I'm just going to wait a few more minutes just to make sure that there's no more questions coming through. Okay. So I'd just like to pass across to Paul Smith. Thank you, Paul, for joining us today. Paul holds an MSc in Forensic Accounting and is a subject matter expert in financial crime. He's worked in law enforcement for 25 years as a serving police officer, a large proportion of which was spent as a financial crime and fraud investigator. And he used his combined skills to investigate major, serious and organised crime, both in the UK and internationally. So certainly an expert in his field. Thank you so much once again, Paul. Over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. If I could just have the next slide, please. I'd just like to give you a little bit of an overview. Thanks for that intro, but a little bit more about me and what I'm all about. So as you heard, I spent 25 years as a police officer. The bulk of that was in CID. I kind of travelled through most departments within CID. I worked on major crime, dealing with sort of homicides, stranger rapes, that sort of thing, serious and organised crime, sort of drug trafficking, drug importation, and then I moved on to an economic crime, where I headed up the force money laundering unit and asset confiscation unit. And then the austerity measures kicked in, and I kind of found myself without a role. So I was then moved into public protection, which was very fortunate for me because it's kind of where I found my passion. So I became the first adults at risk of abuse investigations coordinator for the county of Dorset. Bit of a mouthful, and I always struggle to get my teeth around it, but basically I was the coordinator for the multi-agency investigations where an individual needed the support of a social worker. So that was a brand new role to the force, which required some research to see how other forces were dealing with these sorts of issues up and down the country. So I not only sort of reached out to fellow agencies and police forces, I also conducted a considerable amount of academic research to really understand the issues that people faced, that vulnerable adults faced. So the academic research kind of got me the bug to do some more formal study. So I enrolled on a course as a forensic accountant, a master's degree at Portsmouth University. That was quite a challenge, really, when you consider that although I was a financial investigator, I certainly wasn't an accountant. But nevertheless, I learnt what I needed to and came out, and now I'm qualified to act as an accounting expert. So basically, I'm able to support criminal cases, either for defence or prosecution, court of protection, civil action, what have you. I just really wanted to sort of elaborate a little bit on the term forensic, because there has been some confusion recently, and I just wanted to kind of explain. People always sort of think of forensic in terms of forensic science and, you know, police, CSI investigators. But the term forensic originates from the Latin forensis, meaning before the forum or court. So going back to Roman times, a criminal charge is brought before a group of individuals in the public called the forum. So it's kind of then morphed to become a supporting role for the court. So my duty as an accounting expert, as a forensic accountant, is to be unbiased and just present the facts. So it doesn't matter who actually employs me, I have to be totally unbiased and just present the facts, which can be quite difficult as a former police officer, where really you're gathering evidence to prosecute someone and convict them. So I've kind of had to change my mindset. Can I have the next slide, please? So today I'd like to talk about the extent of the problem of financial abuse. Some of the issues that the police face, I just want to put it in context a little bit for my former colleagues in the police. Talk about some key facts and figures, difficulties encountered when investigating this type of criminality, some of the safeguarding red flags that I kind of look for in my work, and some safeguarding measures that are available. Now, I should say at this point that really I'm looking at predominantly the work that I do is where there's a relationship between the perpetrator and the victim. So a family member or someone who's known to the victim. Go to the next slide, please. So talking about the extent of the problem, and this is something that I discovered from both my academic research and from research from what other police forces are doing. There's a huge underreporting, and there's a piece of work done in the States, in New York, where they talk about the iceberg theory of financial abuse, and it actually it kind of typifies really. There's 1 in 5 cases are reported, very few are investigated, and a very small amount are actually prosecuted, which is quite frightening really. And a lot of this is due to the fact that it takes place in private, between family members or in private setting, and of course compounded by cognitive issues or other frailties of the victim. So then when you sort of factor in the dynamics between the perpetrator and the victim, so you've got a son and mother. Some will know how mum ticks and will obviously know that she would be very reluctant to report any transgression to the police or authorities. So there's lots and lots of things at play here. So when you talk about, I often speak about what is termed the early inheritance syndrome, whereby individuals try to gather the inheritance that they think they're entitled to before it disappears in care fees. So there's often loans made out to family members with no sort of formal agreements between parties. It's very difficult to sort of prove any any fraud in those sort of settings, but it's just something that I've been aware of and tried to find in my investigation. And of course, the big element here is trust. So there's always a trust between the victim and the perpetrator generally, and familial abuse, and that trust is seen by the courts as an aggregating factor quite often. Can I have the next slide, please? So issues for the police, as I said before, police numbers have dwindled. We understand that they're trying to get back and recruiting, but like myself and my colleagues with lots and lots of experience have now gone and not been replaced, and fraud in general is not really understood, let alone this sort of stuff. Fraud units are very, very small. My county, Dorset, there's probably only about 3 officers in the fraud unit, and they only deal with the top end fraud, £1 million plus type thing. So often elder abuse is misunderstood by the police, and I found this up and down the country, and I get so frustrated. From Greater Manchester Police down to Sussex to the Met, they just don't understand that the stuff that I investigate is fraud. They often see it as a civil issue and something that should be dealt with in the civil courts. I had a recent case that I looked at for a customer, and basically she was a sole beneficiary of her mother's estate. Before mother passed away, a relative had conned mother, and I'll say conned because I'm adamant that she was conned into parting with a significant sum of money. Basically, the victim and the perpetrator walked into a high street bank for her to try and transfer money to him, a loan, I say in inverted commas. The bank were very good, and that they separated both parties and sort of tried to find out a little bit more about what the loan was about, which is great. Often that doesn't happen. And basically they thwarted that attempt. What then happened, the victim handed over her bank card to the perpetrator. Now you have to understand that the victim in this case was, in her own words, illiterate. She actually couldn't read or write. So she was particularly vulnerable. She had elements of dementia as well. So what then happened, the suspect drew down the £25,000 in ATM withdrawals. So he drew down something like £200 to £300 a day, sort of up to the limit over a long period of time until he obtained the money. When the police got involved, he said, well, it was a loan for, I'd lent her the money for her to have repairs done on her house. There was some building work done. Had the police actually made the inquiries, they would have ascertained that she actually lived in a housing association property and obviously wouldn't have been responsible for those repairs. There was no repairs. I couldn't convince the police to take the case on. They still saw it as a civil matter, or the money had been gifted and walked away. We ended up actually going to the press in relation to this, and we both, myself and the client, took part in a TV documentary which was aired on Channel 5, fraud robbing your relatives. But we've still not actually got police to take any firm action on this case because they still see it as civil. Anyway, we are where we are with it. So, as I say, there's a lack of specialist trained officers. They don't understand the complexities, that I've mentioned about the sort of interfamilial interaction between parties. There's a lack of understanding of the Mental Capacity Act. And I've found this actually with social workers, which has horrified me, and some even been in a sort of safeguarding environment where they really don't understand the nuances around the Mental Capacity Act and the assessment of capacity. So when you kind of put all this in the mix, it's no wonder that these things aren't sort of prosecuted. And of course, we know that the population is getting older and the problem is just expanding. Go to the next slide, please. So returning to my colleagues in the police service, austerity measures kind of kicked in just before I left the police. You know, I was a victim, again, in inverted commas, of some of the cuts that had to be made. So in fairness, you know, they are dealing with competing demands. I know that officers are shifted, you know, certainly in the County of Dorset, from one end to the other just to, you know, satisfy policing demands. So fraud just doesn't get looked at. This particular news article that's on the screen here, it relates to an interview of an officer from, I don't know which force it was, but basically when asked about fraud investigation, he said, well, it doesn't get a look in because the priority goes to people that bang, bleed or shout. And what he meant by that, probably a bit clunky way of putting it across, but basically those that shouted loudest and banged their, you know, their fist on the desk got attention and their crimes investigated. And of course, those that were injured in a violent crime obviously had got top priority. So this article goes on to say that one particular force filed 96% of cases received from the National Intelligence Bureau where there was a good degree of evidence, including suspects, and those cases were just filed because they just didn't have the resources to deal with the various crimes. You know, they have to triage things on a daily basis, so they have to put the resources where they're needed most. So, you know, fraud, unfortunately, even though where there's a vulnerable victim involved, it just sits in the queue. Can I have the next slide, please? So part of the problem is the fact that, you know, we're in an age, and I include myself in the baby boomers age, whereby people are living longer, people are generally wealthier, so there's more money about, and the average age of a victim is 85, and most are women, and adult sons statistically are the most common perpetrators. And elder financial abuse has been deemed by the study that I referred to with the iceberg theory as the crime of the 21st century, and so true. Can I have the next slide, please? So sadly, the effects of financial abuse, and I had a very delicate conversation with a senior detective, and this guy was my second line manager when I was in my role as coordinator, and he questioned why I was dealing with fraud. He said, you know, force isn't a force priority, so why are you dealing with fraud? And then I had to explain, which I found quite embarrassing really, that actually this isn't just about fraud. You know, financial abuse can have sort of far-reaching ramifications. The effect can be devastating, emotionally, physically, and psychologically. Elderly victims are often never able to replenish lost funds. Many lose large sums of money. The home that they've lived in for years, and they do not receive, you know, they don't receive any sort of income, so can't replenish their loss. Now, there's a piece of research that says that 1 in 10 seniors are victims of elder abuse and neglect, and this is more than the combined total of 1.25 million abused children and 2.3 million victims of domestic abuse. So the victims are there in numbers, and I'm hoping one day the police will understand that, and you know, we'll get back to where we were a few years ago, and I'll have to just keep pounding the door to try and get some positive action taken with my former colleagues. Can I have the next slide, please? So the difficulties of the investigation, just to add a little bit to what I said before, it's a silent crime. So basically what I mean by that is it takes place in a private setting, and it's generally unreported and undetected, and therefore difficult to police. Now you can understand that. So my kind of message there is that, you know, we should all be the eyes and ears of the vulnerable, and, you know, take appropriate action where we see something that's not right. As I said before, there's a fear of recrimination, suspect to perpetrator, or, you know, concern for a breakdown in sort of family relationships. And often, you know, when I've spoken to victims in the past, they don't see this as a police matter. It's a private matter between, you know, parties within the family. And often, you know, workers, social workers or other professionals visiting homes of the vulnerable are reluctant to intrude. There's a really good piece of research done by a Professor Mary Gulhooley called the Financial Abuse Through the Lens of a Bystander Intervention Model. Bit of a mouthful. But basically what this research identified is that often people would see or would hear about abuse, but not take action because they think other people are taking action. Excuse me. And I found this so often, and even with social workers, you know, they think the police were dealing with something when actually they weren't. So they just didn't report matters. Now, the funny side of this particular piece of research, I had printed off, and I took with me to a conference in London, the Action on Elder Abuse conference, which used to be run every year. And the keynote speaker at that time was a chap by the name of Denzel Lush, who was the senior judge at the Court of Protection. And it was a relevant section in Denzel's speech where he talked about, you know, people not taking positive action when they could. So I mentioned about this piece of research, and Denzel came up to me afterwards and said, "Thanks for raising that. That was really useful." He said, "But what you didn't realise," he said, "there was a lady who was only sat in your same row, but 2 seats away, who's a Dr. Gillian Daly, who was one of the co-authors of that piece of research. And what was even worse is I'd actually contacted Gillian because I knew she was attending, and sort of introduced myself. Anyway, I digress. So the message that I want to get across is really, if you see something, just don't assume someone else has taken action. You know, report it to the appropriate authorities and just ensure that that you've done your bit. So just sort of finishing off on this slide, quite often, you know, mentioned about this abuse being a private matter. We had major issues obtaining consent to take action. Now, if the individual was particularly vulnerable and had, you know, sort of advanced dementia, Alzheimer's, then we could take the appropriate action to safeguard them. Social care and the police jointly, or, you know, one or the other would take that action. But if they had capacity and kind of knew that what was going on was wrong, but were reluctant for the authorities to take positive action, then we sadly had to walk away. And I found this the most frustrating part of my work. And on a couple of occasions, you know, we kind of overstepped the mark a little bit, trying to persuade the victim that they were being conned. Excuse me. But sadly, you know, they were in love with the individual, or, you know, it was a close family member, and they just wouldn't take that step to allow us to take positive action. In one particular case, excuse me, there was an elderly gentleman who'd I'll backstep a little bit, so to give you a little bit of backstory. So basically, this lady was working as a cleaner for an elderly lady and helped herself to some checks at the back of a checkbook and forged the signature. She was found out, convicted, but when it came to sentencing, the probation officer made the recommendation to the court that because this lady had a son who got behavioural problems, a custodial sentence wasn't right, so she should serve a community sentence. So what actually happened is they put her in a day centre for the elderly to carry out her community work. It's kind of looked like putting a child sex offender into a kindergarten. So what happened, she recruited the first gentleman she came across, who was a retired wealthy estate agent. They started a relationship. Very soon she started stealing from him. He knew what was going on, but sort of kept a blind, had a blind eye to what was going on. Basically what she would do, she would take his bank card from his wallet during the day. She would go home, draw money down from an ATM and put the card back in his wallet when she returned the next day. I attended his home on several occasions with a colleague and said, she's been convicted. Here's the local press article, which was probably overstepping the mark a little bit. But he said, look, I love her. I know what she's doing. I'm very saddened by what she's doing, but I'm going to put up with it. So we kind of had to leave it. He sadly died. Well, he was in his late 80s anyway, sadly died. And the sting in the tail was, although she'd had big chunks of money and his former wife's jewellery, him being a widower, he'd had the foresight to change his will, so she didn't benefit from his estate, which was that was good for us, but she should have been convicted in my eyes. Can I have the next slide, please? So often, victims with these vulnerabilities are seen as a soft target, easily exploitable. As I said, family members would know of these vulnerabilities and exploit them. And, often we would understand a feeling of guilt that a family member has done this to them and be embarrassed. But even so, would still maintain a sense of loyalty. Their family, what do I do? And would go as far as they could to protect the suspect rather than report the matter. They were of the old school that, family bond should be there to protect them, but sadly, that's not the case in my, the work that I come across in the police. So, some of the things that I would look out for in my current work is whether the person had capacity to undertake contractual arrangements, whether they had testamentary capacity to make a will or a trust or anything like that. But the overall issue that affects vulnerability is loneliness, and it's a big issue for the elderly in general. I mean, my dad lived about 12 miles away from me. I got to see him as often as I could. He lived in a supported living accommodation, but he was lonely. I spoke to him every day on the phone, got to see him as and when I could. But he was supported. There's an awful lot out there that sadly aren't supported, and loneliness is it's a big factor. Go to the next slide, please. So turning to what I describe as red flags, what seemed fairly obvious to me when I start to look through bank accounts are, the unusual volume of activity, where, you've got a person who's probably housebound, where there's lots of ATM withdrawals. I refer back to the lady, with the £25,000. She was wheelchair bound, had difficulty getting out at the best of times, would need support to go out. So look for, the unusual activity, checks made out to cash or to pay off a credit card, changes in account status. I refer to another case, and this one haunts me as well. So you've got suspect lived in the States. Suspect was the daughter. Elderly parents lived in 2 separate care homes in the county Dorset. What happened? Dad died. I won't go into too much detail of how he died because I still think that should have been investigated further, but nevertheless, Dad sadly passed away, but daughter forgot to tell the 2 private pension companies that he'd passed away, and she told the bank that he was now living with her in the States, and so was just carried on receiving his pensions, DWP, pension credit for 2 years, I think it was, before we came on the scene and discovered what she was doing. I'd look for sort of unusual and large transfers, new signatories on account. So where a friend or a neighbour's certainly become involved in someone's finances. I'd want to know why there was a new signatory added to an account. And the biggie for me is where we see unpaid bills or an unexplained shortage of money. That's quite often the trigger for me. And often where we came across these cases of financial abuse in the police is through referrals from social services, and this would come about whereby the family member would seek support, financial support, for either domiciliary care or nursing care, and they would seem to come forward when the trigger threshold was met. So the £23,000, £23,250, which is the sort of threshold whereby anything above that the person would be self-funding their care. Below that, and between 14,250 and 23,250, there would be some support with the care. Below 14,250, there would be fully funded care. And it's strange how many people came forward and really shot themselves in the foot, because had they not been so greedy, they probably would never have been found out. I refer to another, sorry about these war stories, but I dealt with a case whereby the sole beneficiary of the victim's estate was her step-granddaughter. She was in her mid-50s. Gran was in her, well, at that time she was 98, and Nan had sufficient funds to be supported in care for a further 7 years. Granddaughter became a power of attorney and instantly started transferring big chunks of money. She paid off her mortgage. She was charging Gran for visiting her. Now, she lived in Surrey, Gran lived in Dorset. So she was charging Gran something like 50 pence a mile. She was charging for valeting her car for the journey because the car was getting dirty on these trips. She would charge Gran for having a meal, when she got home, because she'd obviously skipped a meal. So she'd take herself to an expensive restaurant and have a meal. She gifted herself something like £3,000 for Christmas birthday, Easter, not only for herself but for her elderly father, who himself was in his early 80s. So basically, she spent Gran's money, and the ironic thing was she was going to be the sole beneficiary, and Gran at the age of 98, she wasn't going to have to wait very much longer to inherit, but it was just greed, and she wanted the money there and then. The early inheritance syndrome kicked in, and she got herself in a great deal of trouble. She got convicted at Bournemouth Crown Court and received, I think, from memory, something like 2 years custodial sentence. And I was a little bit concerned that the jury could go one of two ways. They'd either think, well, what's the point if she's going to inherit? It's her money anyway. But no, it actually took them just 4 hours to convict unanimously, and so she was sentenced to 2 years. What then happened, having done the financial investigation, I then did the asset confiscation. So bearing in mind, monies were owed to the care home where Gran was living, I caused her to, when she came out of prison, to sell her home to pay off the debt to the care home. And because she'd invested some of the money in, she'd actually paid off a mortgage, but she'd also invested in other properties and other investments. She had to pay back the benefit that she gained from the use of that money. So the government actually, she ended up with very little by way of inheritance. So returning back to the slide, just go. So gifting of large sums. Often, we would speak to perpetrators in an interview situation, and they would say, but this is a gift. This is only what Mum would have wanted. If she could tell you, then she would say that that she would be happy with what's happened here. But of course, at that point, Mum had got advanced dementia. Mum couldn't tell us what her wishes were, so it wasn't a gift. It could be a gift because she could have the capacity to gift it. And in a current case that I'm dealing with, the house has been sold in exchange for care for life. Not strictly illegal, but needs a little bit of consideration and proper legal advice before something like that, before you go into a situation like that. Again, the live-in carer and the friendly handyman. So the current case that I'm dealing with for a client, the daughter's ex-husband became the carer for life, was also the handyman. So he actually done a considerable amount of work at the house and overcharged. It's quite a complex issue, but these are the sorts of scenarios that I would come across within the police and still do now as a private consultant. And again, the isolation and loneliness is often the factor whereby the victim would rather put up with the abuse than lose that social contact. But very sad, but that's the way it is. Unless we can get support and reduce that loneliness, then they'd rather put up with it, with the theft than lose that social contact. So next slide, please. So the answer to all this, very complex, but family members have that conversation. So basically, I had it turned into a little bit of a heated conversation with my mother before she passed away, suggesting that lasting power of attorney would be a sensible route to take. Perhaps I hadn't explained it particularly well. She kind of anyway, it didn't go down particularly well. which was kind of ironic with the role that I had at that particular time in the police. And anyway, lasting a power of attorney is a useful tool. I had my concern, having come across issues where it had gone wrong, but nowadays, there is a system in place where you can actually take out a bond, which is like an insurance policy. So you can take out a lasting power of attorney and take out a bond, which, for a few pounds per year or one-off payment, you are protected. In, if something goes wrong, you invest someone's money and it goes wrong, then the bond would pay out and the victim would be reimbursed. I think it's absolutely fantastic idea, something that should have happened a long time ago. There's only one company that I know of provides those bonds, which is the Security Bond Limited. They're based in Dorset, and it's taken them a long time to actually get the go-ahead from the insurance company. Both myself and and Denzel Lush, I mentioned earlier on, have been advocates of this bond. Denzel has spoken openly about his concern about the lasting power of attorney, and now this is the answer to both of our concerns. Just want to take a few moments to talk about, these family arrangements. For both my parents, who had been separated for many, many years before they passed away, I had their bank cards in my wallet, which probably wasn't the most sensible thing to do, really. I had no other family member would question what I did, but it probably wasn't the most sensible thing to carry both my parents' bank cards and use them with their permission. The sensible thing would obviously been to become a power of attorney and manage their finances through, the document which gives you that authority. Estate planning, very important, and it's something that perhaps people should consider before it's too late, is to consider the tax position and taking out a trust or an income bond. And there are other bonds which will protect an estate from the need to pay out for care fees. If it's taken out early enough, and not just when someone's in their late 80s who are just about to go into a care home. These things are taken out in plenty of time, then that they're a really useful tool. So returning to the power of attorney, I had always advocated that if a family member was a power of attorney, then you should perhaps have a professional like a lawyer to also act as an attorney. So there can be no questions about integrity. I've mentioned here about Experian. If you have any concerns about vulnerability of a family member, then for the sake of a few pounds, you can have an Experian report, which will show any applications that have been made for financial, credit cards and the like. And it's a good trigger at times. So I mentioned about the lasting power of attorney bond. If you become a deputy, there's a requirement to have a bond anyway, so that's kind of written into statute. But Lynn Coombs from the Security Bond Service also introduced a little while back an appointeeship bond. So that's whereby if someone's receiving state benefits and a person is acting as an appointee, they can take out a similar bond, which again protects against any issues, not necessarily fraudulent. There might be you've taken the wrong advice and the person's lost out through benefits or something like that. Go to the next slide, please. So I just, as a sort of fraud investigator, we are guided by what used to be called the fraud triangle, which talks about opportunity, incentive, and rationalization. So when those 3 points merge, that's when a fraud could take place. Opportunity is, if there is no safeguards in place to prevent the fraud. Incentive is someone needs that money, so they would, they take that extra step to, someone say has a gambling habit, for instance, they would take the next step and, have the incentive to carry out the act. Rationalization is, well, perhaps, they, sorry, my phone is going, which is buzzing away, which is distracting me. I should have turned it off. So rationalization is where they just rationalize their behavior. It's, like I said before, it's only what mum would have wanted. So therefore, it's my money. I'm going to do what I want with it. So the fraud triangle has been extended to become the fraud theory. And I'll just read out this slide in its entirety. Opportunity opens the doorway to fraud, and incentive, i.e. pressure and rationalization, can draw the person toward it. However, the person must have the capability to recognize the open doorway as an opportunity and take advantage of it by walking through it, not just once, but repeatedly. And can I have the next slide, please? And that's my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions now.
Thank you so much, Paul. I mean, that is a huge subject, and one that is not one that's probably going to go away anytime soon, unfortunately, but it's given us a real good insight into the kind of, especially the red flags and the answers. I think that's really useful. I'd just like to ask personally, what responsibilities does the bank, or do the banks have with regards to fraud prevention for vulnerable people?
Banks have introduced there's a new code of conduct whereby if they have a vulnerable person in front of them, a teller at a bank, then they have a duty to contact the police, and the police attend, and that's worked really well. The banks are bound by what's called the Turnier rules, whereby if it's something that's going to affect their client or affect the bank, then they have a duty to act. But then there's the Turnier rules, but then there's also the Banking Secrecy Act, whereby they're also required to protect the financial assets of their client. So it's a bit of a mix there, but they should act. And a lot of this stuff is down to the banks. When we receive the suspicious activity reports from the banks, when I was running the money laundering unit, and we could act quickly, then we got a good result.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. If you want to put your camera back on, Paul, that would be lovely. We've actually got a question that's come through. I'll just read it verbatim. So you said that police fraud units perhaps only deal with £1 million plus crimes. Do you have any tips on dealing with suspected fraud for similar amounts, smaller amounts, beg your pardon, i.e. £4,000? It is just down to making as much noise as possible, or is it to try? Just forgive me 1 second, just try and scroll down. Try and get, how do you basically try and get the police to take the issue seriously?
Listen, it's so difficult. I had to fight for, and this person wasn't vulnerable, I have to say. So this is a corporate victim of fraud. We're talking about £50,000 roughly. A member of his staff had actually had their hand in the till, and eventually I got it to the Met, but I had to climb up the ladder to, it had been investigated but very poorly. I had to climb up the ladder. I got as far as the superintendent, and then when the superintendent got involved, things started to happen. But I knew the route in. So victims, it's so difficult now. I like to say there's an easy answer, but there isn't. I've tried my hardest to get things, get some traction with people, but it's just not easy. It's all about threat, risk, and harm. And if you tick those boxes, then you know, you've got half a chance.
Absolutely, thank you. So have you seen an increase in fraudulent activity or scams since COVID, because lots of people are under pressure financially? Have you seen that see a significant rise or not?
Yes, yeah, in a nutshell, yes. You know, it's created an opportunity for fraudsters, and knowing how little action the police generally take, it's just open season, sadly. And you know, the fact that you know, we've been sort of confined, you know, within our homes, you know, we're probably online more, and people have been, you know, more and more victim of these fraudsters.
It's the awareness, isn't it, of things that are true and false, and fraudsters are very clever at making things look very very real, aren't they? Especially through email scams, for example. So just going back to looking at you know, the people who are vulnerable potentially and also lonely, I think it's really important just to note actually the importance of just really looking, if we are looking, going back to the care subject, is just making sure that people do their due diligence, and I think that's the importance of looking at a regulated provider and also weighing up the benefits, pros and cons of looking at that versus an unregulated. And I think it's the kind of the ability to take on risk and how people are happy to either mitigate risk or take a risk on themselves. So I just want to put it out there to say that us at the Good Care Group, we're very much focused on making sure that a risk is mitigated by doing those DBS checks on behalf of clients and client representatives, and just making sure that we have the right appropriate carers in place to ensure that they are of quality and good standing and of high value. But this goes back to making sure when people do require care or they're lonely and they might use a befriending service, to make sure that that person is of integral values and of withstanding. So and I think from personal experience, I can probably say that I have had an experience where there was a vulnerable situation for a loved one, and potentially they also are a victim of being exposed to a befriending service when it wasn't always probably welcomed. So I think it's very important that it's not just, it affects us all. I think it affects us all in different ways, especially as people are living behind screens at the moment.
Do you know, it's funny, you know, I mentioned about my parents being in two separate sides of the county. They're about 35 miles apart, which was a bit of a nightmare. But yeah, I got a befriending service for both parents, and it was, the reception was very different. So my mum didn't want anything to do with it really. My dad, however, loved it. So this old chap, that's, he's ex-RAF, same as my dad. He had a dog. My dad loved dogs, and he really looked forward to his visit. It's such a useful service.
And it is absolutely, it's a fantastic service, and it's the ability, isn't it, of getting the common interest, and I think that's really important. But it's just goes back to everybody just needs to do the due diligence, and we all have that responsibility. I think that's the key message that I've taken away, is we all have that responsibility, that if something doesn't look right, it doesn't feel right, it's highly probable that it's not right. It's somebody pulling foul.
I did a webinar last week actually for someone, and the thing that I closed it with is, you know, with these scams, you know, my talk was about, you know, the familial sort of connection with people, but with these scams, you know, I just kind of said, look, there's no such thing as a free lunch. You know, if it just looks too good to be true, it probably.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are no further questions unless anyone wants to type any further questions within the panel.
I just wanted to say as well, I didn't mention, there's obviously the safeguarding route. So, you know, if you're reluctant to actually pass the information yourself, you know, you can go through the safeguarding route, and it will be assessed and hopefully dealt with. You know, I've got a daughter-in-law who's a safeguarding social worker, and, you know, they're always happy to go out and do a visit just to assure themselves that the person's okay.
Thank you. It's been a really interesting session, so I appreciate your time, Paul, because I know you're extremely busy, and fraud is not going to disappear overnight, and you've got a lot of work to do on that. So I wish you all the very best, everybody, and thank you all for your time, especially to Paul today. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.